Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Salim. I'm the president of the Middle East Institute, speaking to you from Washington, D.C. I'm very honored and pleased to welcome you today to an event launching a new book by a renowned French philosopher and an activist and moral voice on international affairs, Mr. Bernard-Henri Lévy. The book that we are having the honor to publish from MEI is called Past as Prologue, Revisiting Bernard-Henri Lévy's 2002 report on Afghanistan. This book includes, for the first time, an English translation of Mr. Lévy's 2002 report for the French government on the situation in Afghanistan. We are revisiting that work to see what progress or not has been made in the last 2 decades on the eve or as the U.S. ends a 20-year engagement there, as Afghanistan faces new challenges, hopefully some opportunities as well. Today, obviously, much has changed in the situation, but still there's much continuity there. The book that is available on Amazon, and the link will be provided in the chat and to everyone, also featured, and we're very grateful for that, featured a foreword or a preface by General David Petraeus, who's also done us the honor of being with us today. General Petraeus assumed command of the NATO International Security Assistance Force and U.S. Forces Afghanistan in 2010, and also had served as commander of the United States Central Command. He's had a brilliant long career in the military, commanding forces in Iraq, as well in the Army and Marine Corps counterinsurgency group, and the 101st Airborne, and so on. After his military career, he also served as director of the Central Intelligence Agency from September 6, 2011 until November 2012. You can read the general's complete biography on our website. After the general's opening remarks, I will hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Marvin Weinbaum. Marvin is our esteemed director of the Afghanistan and Pakistan program here at the Middle East Institute that oversees our work in that region. He will properly introduce Mr. Lévy, and then we will listen to Mr. Lévy's valuable remarks. And then Marvin graciously will lead a discussion involving Mr. Lévy and hopefully Mr. Petraeus and other guests of Marvin to discuss the work and its importance. It's important to mention that Dr. Weinbaum also contributed a detailed text introduction to Mr. Lévy's text, which is this introduction, this long article, long analysis, is a main feature of the book as well that I hope you can all purchase and read soon. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, and I turn it over to General Petraeus.
Well, thanks very much for the kind introduction, Paul. It is a privilege once again to be with MEI. It was a privilege to write the preface for the English version of Bernard-Henri Lévy's report on Afghanistan, written some 20 years ago. And it is always a privilege to be with Bernard as we are here again today. As this audience will know, he is a brilliant thinker, occasionally a brilliant dreamer, human rights activist, a philosopher, and someone with a penchant for difficult causes. And I have been a fellow traveler with him on some of those causes, including certainly the Syrian Kurds, and obviously the Afghans after the Taliban. His report, only recently translated into English, is worth reading even some 20 years later, because over a period of months, he visited every corner of Afghanistan, meeting with notables and ordinary people alike, gathering information from all quarters, brilliantly analyzing people and situations, and putting his finger on ancestral issues, past errors, and above all, new possibilities. Throughout, he emphasized the extraordinary opportunity offered by international aid and protection to a country so long forgotten and so often martyred. an opportunity for Afghanistan to open itself to the world while continuing to celebrate its own history and traditions. With realism, that is, without ever losing sight of the material and financial means required, nor the challenging realities of Afghanistan, Bernard proposed a series of actions to be taken without delay. At the core of his report were recommendations to neutralize local warlords by building a state, an army, a police force, and public agencies, as well as a proposal to circumvent stubborn mullahs by forming a corps of black hussars of democracy, teachers, primary care doctors, local administrators, civil engineers, and agronomists to be sent into the most distant provinces. Working together, Bernard argued, Afghans, Americans, Europeans, and representatives of Muslim countries around the world could move mountains. And that is not a trivial observation, given that the Hindu Kush Mountains define the spine of Afghanistan. And here I'd like to read the final paragraphs from my preface to his newly published report. I do not know to what extent France implemented the measures Bernard put forward. By the time I was privileged to assume command of the International Security Assistance Force in 2010, France was an important member of the coalition effort, but the US contributions in funding, forces, development assistance, and diplomacy dwarfed those of all the other contributing nations put together. Beyond that, it is, of course, the fate of many well-intentioned academic reports to be buried once the author has been praised and thanked. But reading Lévy's report 20 years later tells us a great deal about what might have been done, not just by France, but by the US-led coalition. There were, to be sure, immeasurable accomplishments over the years, not just in the fight against al-Qaeda and its allies in the Taliban. But the price has been high. So many Afghan lives lost, so many American and coalition country soldiers killed, so many billions spent, only to end up on the threshold of a seemingly ignominious withdrawal of the last of US and coalition forces that helped Afghan forces protect their country and the Afghan people's daily resistance against their former oppressors. Now, after 4 years of diplomatic meandering, isolationist pronouncements, and periodically unpredictable policy decisions, including on Afghanistan, a new US administration is proclaiming that America is back and seeking to resume its true place in the world. This includes recommitting to American leadership of the free world to the defense of people struggling against tyranny, foreign occupation, and obscurantism. What is not clear is whether there is recognition in Washington that endless wars do not end with a withdrawal or drawdown of American involvement. In the case of Afghanistan, for example, it appears that the endless war will continue and quite likely get worse, as already seems to be the case. And that may result in the return of a brutal medieval regime in which extremists once again find safe haven. Bernard-Henri Lévy's report and the lofty aspirations in it, while far from fully realized, nonetheless did point to many of the accomplishments of the past 20 years. Needless to say, return of Taliban rule would at best undermine or at worst reverse much of the progress achieved during that time. As that prospect looms, perhaps it is time to revisit what once was hoped and envisioned by revisiting Lévy's report of nearly 2 decades ago, and to reflect on the various factors, missteps, and mistakes that prevented realization of the vision of someone broadly recognized as a true visionary. Thank you.
Thank you, General Petraeus. Thank you for those remarks, which I, particularly your closing remarks, which I fully concur with. We're honored that you were able to join us today and of course have contributed your full preface. I now have the distinct pleasure of introducing Bernard-Henri Lévy, author of Past and Prologue, the book that brings us together today. The book's a translation of a lengthy report that he submitted to the President of France, based on his visit to Afghanistan several months following its liberation in 2001. The author was asked by the president to undertake a state mission to evaluate the conditions in Afghanistan and recommend how France could contribute to its rebirth as a nation. Most of our viewers know the author is a distinguished French philosopher, filmmaker, activist, and the author of over 30 books. His work as an intellectual and writer is uniquely intertwined with his humanitarian activism. His history with Afghanistan is long and rich. He first met Ahmad Shah Massoud, the legendary resistance leader, in the 1980s, when he delivered the first radio transmitters to help the Afghan resistance fighting the Soviet occupation to build a radio station called Radio Kabul Libre, Radio Free Kabul. The author's most recent visit to Afghanistan was in September 2020 at the invitation of Dr. Abdullah Abdullah, chairman of the High Council for National Reconciliation. While he was there, he had extensive time with Ahmad Massoud, the son of the late commander. So now, Mr. Lévy, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Marvin. Thank you very much. I'm very honored to present this book in the Middle East Institute. Very honored that you decided to publish it after so long, and very, very honored and thrilled to be presented by General David Petraeus. For me, General, it means a lot to have this new companionship with you. We are already together on the board of our dear Justice for Kurds under the behalf and friendship of our dear Thomas Kaplan, to have you again on my personal road with this book, which is so dear to my heart, is really a great privilege. And I do mean that. To introduce this discussion, my dear Marvin, my dear Paul, I would like to say a few words about the history of this report. Because at the end of the day, it is not so banal that a writer, a philosopher, a free spirit is asked such a report by the president of his country. Even in France, it is strange. So I suppose that in America, it must be even more strange. So I owe you, my dear Marvin, my dear Paul, my general, Mr. Ambassador, I owe you the other side of the mirror in a few minutes. I never told this story as I will tell it to you now, but it is full of meaning regarding the current state of affairs. I am familiar with Afghanistan since a long, long time. I met Commander Massoud in the 80s, as you properly said, Marvin, and I met him again and again, and I had a long stay with him in Panjshir in 1998. I was there for a reportage for the newspaper Le Monde, and I spent a few days at his side at the hottest time and hardest time of his fight against Taliban. Remember, at this time, 1998, the Taliban had gained most of the country, and Commander Massoud was besieged and resisting with a great bravery, nearly alone at the head of his northern alliance in his fortress of Panjshir. Panjshir was such in a desperate state at this time, nearly no link with the external world. I remember he had, Commander Massoud, at this time, only one helicopter left, making the link between his home, his village, and the capital of Tajikistan, Dushanbe. And it was such an old helicopter in bad state that he had to make a stop in Talokan, if I remember well, in order to be able to go till Tajikistan. So I spent 10 days or 2 weeks with him, and I leave him with such a broken heart and so much anxiety that I make him the promise that I suggest first to him to do all that he can in order to break the silence and to call help to the rest of the world. And I commit myself in helping as much as I can to have his message conveyed. And I tell him, please come to France. I know you never came to France. I know you never came to Europe. I know you never came to the West. He only traveled, I think, at this time once or twice, a few times in Tajikistan. But please, Commander, for once, move, come to France. I will arrange a meeting with the highest authorities of my country, and you will have to tell them yourself with your words, with your experience, what I will try myself, but in an awkward way to say. Commander Massoud says to me, done deal. If you arrange a visit, this visit to Paris, and meetings with the highest authorities of your country, including President Chirac, I will come. I come back to France. Through one of our common friends, I go to Chirac. I ask him, will you meet Commander Massoud, etc., etc. My president says, okay, done deal too. If Massoud comes to Paris, if, as you are telling me, Mr. Lévy, he has important things to say, of course, I will receive him. Time goes by, time passes, weeks, months, 1 year, 2 years. The appointment is many times taken and delayed because of the situation of the ground. 4 times, Commander Massoud asked one of his guys to call me and to say, the chief is ready, he comes. And 4 times, he calls again saying, the chief cannot come, the border is closed, helicopter is out of order, the chief, Massoud, is on the battlefield trying to repel an attack, and so on and so on. After 3 years, in April 2001, our contact, Engineer Isaac, was his name, in Afghanistan, tells me, this time, Mr. Bernard, it's done. Commander Massoud, the chief, as he called him, is going to come whatever the price, whatever the cost, the moral, political, and military cost. So I organize the visit to Paris. I send Commander Massoud a plane in Dushanbe, and I organize all the visit in Paris with the help of a few friends, including General, one of your colleagues, French General Morillo. At this moment, there is one of these imbroglio, one of these quid pro quo, one of these misunderstanding, one of these maneuvers of which the political life is, alas, full. Probably some people in the French political scene don't like the idea of Chirac meeting legendary Commandant Massoud. Maybe 1 year before a French presidential race, there was some, it was a bad idea for some of Chirac adversaries. I don't have the complete key, but the fact is that a few hours before Massoud leaving Dushanbe, President Chirac makes me know that he has some conflict of agenda, that it is complicated for him, and that he will not receive Commandant Massoud. Commandant Massoud nevertheless comes. I am stubborn. He was decided also, and we decide to maintain the trip. I organized a B plan at this time with my friend General Morillon and the president of the European Assembly of this time, Mrs. Nicole Fontaine, and we organized a big speech of Commandant Massoud in the European Parliament. No appointment with President Chirac, but a big speech delivered in the European Parliament. And he comes to Paris, but alas, without seeing Chirac, in a sort of half private, half public visit. He meets the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Hubert Védrine, but it is not the level which I expected. And he leaves Paris very sad, having the feeling to not to have fulfilled completely the mission which he gave to himself, and with the feeling not to have conveyed the message he wanted to convey. This message, he gave it to a group of friends, among whom me and others, but in a private meeting. The message was the growth of Al-Qaeda. The message was more and more political and sophisticated plans against the West. The message was the link more and more strong between Mullah Omar and Bin Laden and Pakistan. This was the triangle of the hate for Massoud. This message was delivered to the Minister Védrine, to private assemblies of friends, but not to the level he wanted. And he comes back to his village and to Panjshir. This is April or May. I did not have to check 2001. 4 months after, what he had in his mind took a precise shape and happened. It was September 11, the mass murder of September 11, and 2 days before, it was his own death, as we all know. In the whole world, of course, it was a huge blast. This mass murder against America was the turning point of the modern times, a big emotion. And as you all know, this war, this liberation war against the Taliban, to which France was associated. President Chirac, when the war was over, when it was won, when the Taliban were defeated in November 2001, he invited me for a chat at Élysée Palace for a cup of tea. And he told me that he was happy to have participated in this war of liberation, that he was happy to have, in these circumstances, it was not the same a few years after in Iraq, but to have been at the side of America, who is the historic ally of France. But he told me that a part of him was sorry, and even more, that he had a sort of remorse of not having met, as it was scheduled, Commandant Massoud 4 months before his death, when he came in Paris to warn and to launch a strong appeal. And as a sort of reparation, compensation, reparation, he asked me this day, November 2001, having been one of the organizers of the visit of Massoud in Paris, knowing this whole story from the start, he asked me if I would agree to go on the ground, to spend a few months there, and to bring back some propositions, some recommendation about the way in which France could participate in the nation building of the new Afghanistan. For Jacques Chirac, it was a way to repair. It was a way to correct what appeared to him as a mistake he committed by underestimating the message which Massoud had to convey when he came in Strasbourg, capital of Europe, and then to Paris, but on a semi-public level. This is the history, the origin. Then I spent a few months on the ground, as General Petraeus said, as you, Marvin, said also. I spent the following month crossing the country, going in every place I could. There was at this time a French embassy with nobody inside. I was the only one. It was my base, my base camp. From there, I went to Herat, I went to Mazar-e Sharif, I went to Jalalabad, of course, I went to the Pakistani border, and so on and so on. And I brought back this little book, which you have in your hands today at the Middle East Institute, and which is the occasion of our meeting. Then, as David Petraeus said, this report had, of course, the fate of many reports, a little praised and a lot put aside, but not completely. There was a commitment of France because of the context I described, and especially of President Chirac, to move on, to be a doer, to try. And there are a few of these recommendations which I did, which were implemented. I could detail them in the discussion if you want. There are a few who were implemented. We, the West in general, did a lot to nation build the new Afghanistan. It is not true that the 20 last years, with the high cost in human lives, American lives, French lives, and foremost Afghan lives, it is not true that these decades was for nothing. There was a lot of things done. There was in the organization of in the building of an administration, in the organization of the army, in many fields, a lot was done. And I can be witness of the fact that when I came back a few months ago, I saw a completely new country due to the great efforts of our joined forces. Hello? Can you hear me? Can you still hear me? Yeah, okay. Due to our joint forces, I saw a few months ago a new country with young women unveiled, with a group of press Tolo News, incredibly modern, with a sense of freedom in the press, which I could not have imagined 20 years before, with the warlords having seen their power strongly reduced, and with the civil society really improving and growing from nearly zero. So we did a lot. America first, America before anyone, Europe after. We did a lot. We achieved a lot. These decades and the price of life which we had was not for nothing. And why do I say that? Because it is all the more depressing for me as an old friend of Afghanistan, and I'm sure for most of you, and first of all for General Petraeus, who spent such a part of his life devoted to this cause, it's all the more depressing to see the situation which we, Afghans and Westerners, are facing together, which is this abandonment, this withdrawal, this betrayal by America and by the West in general of our Afghan brother in arms, fellows in soul, comrade in democracy. It's so sad because having modestly the range since the 80s till last September of the, I have the range of the, to have a real look on all that. The progress was considerable. The task well achieved was huge. We were on the good road. We were on the road, the good one. And we decided to cut it for a reason which none of us, at least which I don't know, I'm not sure anyone knows it here, but you will say, we have decided to erase all that and to quit. And for me, this whole story started with this visit, with my visit to Afghanistan, and the visit of Masoud in Paris, ending now, is a story of hope and a story of terrible sorrow. And this is what I wanted to say in introduction to this discussion, my dear Marvin.
Thank you so very much. That was a fascinating retelling of your experiences, and I think it will enrich in our understanding greatly now of just what the situation was then and what we have today. In that respect, we're going to move on now to a discussion. And for that, we have joining us Ambassador Javed Ahmed. Javed is the Afghan ambassador in UAE, and we know Ahmed as well for his years as a non-resident scholar senior scholar at the Atlantic Council here in Washington. A great deal, as has been said, has changed in Afghanistan since 2001, much of it for the good. Those of us who witnessed how it was under the Taliban rule or the years following the intervention, and for myself here, my first visits to Afghanistan were more than 50 years ago, so I have a very broad perspective. That intervention ousted Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and the contrast, as Mr. Lévy has indicated with today, is really extraordinary since his visit in 2001 and the years after. But just as there are areas in which the hopes and expectations of the Afghan people have been realized, over the last 20 years. There are also other areas where the country is seen by Afghans and the international community as having fallen sadly short. So let me ask all of us here, in what ways has Afghanistan most succeeded? And where has it experienced its greatest disappointments? And let me ask Ambassador Javed Ahmed if he would start us off.
Thank you, Marvin. And it's an honor to be in this discussion with Mr. Lévy, Bernard, if I may, and Jennifer Petraeus, both of whom I very much admire. Thank you for standing with Afghanistan all these years. My views are those of an ordinary Afghan, as an official now, of course, but also as an American citizen who's been exposed to developments on the ground in Afghanistan, but also in DC, in Washington, but also in some other capitals. I enjoyed reading Bernard's observations and reflections. In the report, he wrote some, 20 years ago, which I think are very much relevant in today's context. I was very impressed how he managed to capture a great deal in that document in only a month-long visit, in literally in the first year of the US-led campaign in Afghanistan. What also struck me the most is that the incredible foresight about possible futures in developments. The report quite accurately captured at the time when there was a great deal of uncertainty about how the US in Western engagement will play out. So my personal reflection is that there are always hopes and optimisms at the beginning of any such ambitious and very large scale campaigns. And of course, as individuals, we look at and we analyze such engagements from a perspective of where we sit. And now looking at it from an ordinary Afghan perspective, I must say there were a lot of hopes and aspirations in the early years of that Western campaign. There was much that was done right, as was mentioned, of course, from education to healthcare to media to women's rights and human rights, but basically, the Afghan flag flying around the world and actually recognized for the good things. But there were also a great deal that were not done right, particularly with respect to the war management, the governance and some of the leadership failures we witnessed in Kabul, and how the internal Afghan politics were dealt with often. So my impression is that by looking at the positive side of the Western engagement, ordinary Afghans see Afghanistan largely as a glass half full, because in the end, that's what mattered to them. They are survivalists. But then again, Afghans are also clear-eyed about the challenges facing the country, especially right now. And so the vast majority of the Afghan people believe right now that the glass half full won't actually matter if we are going to end up throwing the glass away altogether. And this, very inherent fear has become quite salient, quite prominent since President Biden's decision to withdraw was announced. Now, I would make a few observations as to what went wrong, perhaps, what should have been done differently, particularly on the US sides, which I think are relevant to, much of Bernard's recommendations and observations in today's context, particularly. Now, from the beginning of the campaign, the US faced to a large extent, perhaps by its own doing, at least three very important dependencies, which we up until today didn't manage to overcome. The first is, and this was something that's been alluded to on multiple occasions in Bernard's report, is the very dangerous dependence on Afghan warlords as allies, quote unquote. Now, these warlords effectively resembled a deck of 52 cards. So the de facto 9/11 profiteers who were constantly shuffled and reshuffled at the expense of embracing, or US and Western partners of Afghanistan, embracing the Afghan people who were and are to this day the United States and Europe's best allies. Now, I understand the argument that some make that there were no alternatives at the time, but that dependency factor, that warlord dependency factor in the decades that followed, essentially created a very predatory and a very kleptocratic system of governance in Afghanistan that the Afghan people and the Afghan government, including the current one, are struggling with to overcome. So in that sense, warlords have become a central and a very toxic part of the power dynamics in Afghanistan. And that toxic nature of those folks are arguably no different than what they were in the 1990s. Now, I will also say that the word warlord is a very loaded term under which today, in today's context, much of the criminal activities take place, from organized crime to drug trafficking, to terrorism financing, to engaging in predatory governance and mafia type politics. And we have seen it repeatedly in Kabul. So if there is an uncivil war right now between Afghan political leaders, the result of that is because it's essentially the result of that dependency factor on warlords. And this dependency, unfortunately, has now effectively become, this US dependency have effectively become an Afghan dependency. The second I would mention is the very similar, very dangerous and toxic dependence on Pakistan. Now, this dependence and reliance, and oftentimes over-reliance from the start of the campaign, proved more dangerous than anything else, perhaps. And this is my argument. And this is perhaps the key reason for our collective failure in Afghanistan. Now, I can tell you that from the very start, successive US administrations failed essentially to openly designate and treat Pakistan on a policy level as either a fickle friend or a clever enemy. In Pakistan, in their own ways, shrewdly managed to weather all kinds of pressures in transition with very serious consequences for Afghanistan, including to this very day. Now, today, for example, and this is very relevant to what Bernard mentioned very eloquently in his report, is that Pakistan today have an organized, large-scale, expendable militant fighting force that's operating in Afghanistan. And by today, I mean like literally today, how this formation has changed since President Biden has announced the withdrawal. The Afghan Taliban are just one part of that elaborate militant force. So in a non-conventional sense, you can even characterize this as an invasion of sorts. So on the Afghan part, the bigger challenge with respect to Pakistan is that the United States or Afghanistan never really reached a common definition of terrorism. Their definition, the Pakistani definition of terrorism, is that Pakistan's enemy should be my enemy or Afghanistan's enemy, but it shouldn't be the other way around. So even though Pakistan today, for example, realizes that in the end of the day, you cannot find a better Muslim than an Afghan, they have very cleverly managed to mainstream commercial Taliban. I will repeat this, commercial Taliban, to fight for their own very perverse version of commercial Islam. So the question would be, in this case, what does the Pakistanis want? And it's not just one Pakistanis we're dealing with. There are layers and layers of different categories of Pakistanis on the policy, but also technical level that wants very different things. Pakistan's preferred game, I would argue, in Afghanistan is that they don't want a political settlement, but they want a military settlement that effectively takes into account Taliban's territorial gains. Now, the military settlement should then be followed by a political settlement along the terms of that military deal. Now, Pakistani leaders say we have done everything short of military action. We don't need military action as an Afghan from the Pakistanis. We ask Pakistan to do basic policing work inside their own territory. So for example, they should go after the Taliban fighters and their leaders the same way they're going after corrupt Pakistani politicians. It's a test of sincerity on their end. So what they want from us essentially is for us to accept a limited form of sovereignty, is basically to eventually treat us, and even right now to treat us as a half state, which is unacceptable on many ends. Last point, very quickly, is that in any nation building exercise, we should set very clear expectations from the start with very clear approach and accountability. Now, from the very early years, there was, a growing gap between Western ambitions in Afghanistan's readiness as a country, as a state, or the willingness on the political level in Kabul to properly absorb those changes. And that gap, interestingly, reversed in the later years of that US/Western engagement. Here, I want to particularly flag the institution building exercise, which, first, I very much agree with Bernard's earlier observation, recommendation to his own government with respect to building the Afghan security forces. I think it was a very important recommendation, even though the French did not end up being in the Afghan security forces training exercises, or they didn't train any of the Afghan battalions, or didn't raise a special Afghan counterterrorism force as was mentioned in the report. But they did play a very important role in supporting the Afghan forces, as General Petraeus alluded to. But two important lessons, I think, stand out from in the years that followed. First is that we started raising and training the Afghan forces quite late. And when we did, an inordinate amount of focus was placed on the number or quantity of the force rather than on the quality of it. And it didn't quite help. And I think this is something that we're struggling with even today. Now, the second thing was, what also didn't quite help, and I think which remains an important challenge today, was how raising Afghan forces were loosely modeled after US forces' own model, where there's a heavy reliance on the Air Force. The problem was that the Afghan Air Force didn't quite exist. So, and the sky was owned by the United States. So that created this third layer of dependency on the Afghan forces, which relied very heavily on the United States air power. And this struggle and this dependency remains to this day. So on the positive side, there's a great deal, but I wanted to highlight just some of these things. Of course, happy to answer any questions, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Javed. We have about 10 minutes remaining, and I think we all want to hear General Petraeus and Bernard-Henri Lévy comment on this issue here, as well as what we have value so much in what's happened over these 20 years and our disappointments. General Petraeus, thoughts?
Well, thanks again, and very nicely done, mon ami. Magnifique, fantastique. Just wonderful words, Bernard, as always. And thanks to Ambassador Javed Ahmed for his thorough and very eloquently made points. When it came to, what did we do well, what was most successful, I think it's actually pretty important to recall that we accomplished the mission that took us to Afghanistan in the first place, and that actually kept us there afterward. Again, I applaud, I reveled in, we celebrated the many additional achievements, but at the end of the day, this is about eliminating the sanctuary in which Al-Qaeda planned the 9/11 attacks and conducted the initial training of those attackers under Taliban rule in Afghanistan. And of course, the Taliban refused to eliminate that sanctuary themselves. So we had to do that. We have also subsequently, we stayed to prevent Al-Qaeda from reestablishing that kind of sanctuary, something that they have repeatedly sought to do. And a task that is often overlooked is that we also provided a very important platform for the regional counterterrorism campaign, which often included operations in Afghanistan's neighbor Pakistan, where, of course, Osama bin Laden was located, Al-Qaeda senior leadership, and a variety of other nefarious actors. And now, of course, the Islamic State is in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region in the form of the Khorasan group. And of course, the most important demonstration of the importance of that platform was the operation in my final few months as the commander in Afghanistan, albeit with those forces under the director of the CIA that night, which brought Osama bin Laden to justice and was launched from and recovered to Afghanistan. Obviously, there were many, many other very important achievements. Again, as the ambassador noted, in education, especially, frankly, for women, improved basic services, infrastructure, cell phone access, electricity, healthcare, freedom of the press, economic opportunities that didn't exist before. Again, notably, in particular, for women who had a very marginal place, needless to say, under Taliban rule, and generally were not allowed to go to school, much less to college. But obviously, there were very frustrating aspects over the years. Indeed, there were missteps on the battlefield. There were certainly innumerable cases of inadequate governance that all the way from the local to the national level. Pervasive corruption was a huge issue over the years. We had to create joint task forces to try to combat it. Political disunity has been an enormous frustration as well, especially as other governments have poured so much of their own resources into that country. But of course, there's also been a lack of consistent US policy. And at the end of the day, this has always been a US led and frankly, US dominated endeavor, especially after the first few years. We always made very, very clear our desire to draw down, to leave, even while negotiating with an enemy who had no real urgency because of, as the ambassador pointed out very correctly, they have sanctuaries in Pakistan. There's a reason the Taliban leadership is called the Quetta Shura, because it's located outside Quetta, the capital of Baluchistan province in Pakistan. There's a reason that there's a Peshawar Shura, again, and also the Haqqani Network and Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan and various others who are in the federally administered tribal areas, what used to be known as the Northwest Frontier Province, and so forth. And of course, this has been hugely frustrating. It's literally the single most challenging contextual issue in a country that is full of challenging contextual issues. I once did a comparison for Secretary Rumsfeld on my way home from the 3-star tour in Iraq. I came home through Afghanistan at his request and did an assessment of the situation in Afghanistan. And I noted in the very first slide, Afghanistan does not equal Iraq, and laid out all the different factors, which of course would, when I testified before Congress for confirmation to be the commander in Afghanistan, noted would prevent us from achieving in Afghanistan what we had done in Iraq. In other words, a dramatic reduction in violence and a significant progress on the battlefield. Not that we could not make progress, but that certainly we weren't going to have the kind of dramatic flipping of a country that we had seen during the surge in Iraq. Indeed, I later observed that it took us all the way until the fall of 2010 just to get the inputs right in Afghanistan, because of course we went in and very quickly shifted our focus and our assets and so forth to Iraq. And yes, I was part of the reason for that. You know, as Admiral Mullen used to say, in Iraq, we do what we must. In Afghanistan, we do what we can. And it was not until late 2010 that we finally got roughly the right level of resources. I'm not just talking military, but also civilian assistance, development, aid, and so forth, the right organizational architecture, the right people, the right preparation of our forces, and a number of other factors. That's 9 years during which we did not have the inputs right. And this did not coincide purely with my arrival as a commander. It started very much earlier with that, as General McChrystal took over, as he did his assessment, as there were additional forces committed, and so forth over the years. The tragedy here, I think, is that we have never truly embraced what I think are the most important lessons of 20 years of fighting against Islamist extremists. And that is to accept that you may not be able to win in a traditional military sense. You can't take a hill, plant the flag, and go home to a victory parade. Rather, you have to keep pressure, even after you have literally destroyed the enemy, as we did Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which became the Islamic State in Iraq during the surge and kept down for a subsequent 3.5-year period before the achievements there were undone by highly sectarian actions by the Iraqi prime minister. So you have to keep an eye on this. And in Afghanistan, that is particularly true, given the challenges of the sanctuaries that the leadership and the logistical bases and so forth of these forces have. So my prescription was always a sustainable commitment, and sustainability being measured in the expenditure of blood and treasure. And frankly, I think that we had reached a position like that a few years ago in Afghanistan, and I am obviously one who very much feels that we will come to regret the decision to withdraw, to draw down our forces the way we have in Afghanistan, and fear that it will usher back in the kinds of very violent civil war that will result in millions of refugees, terrible loss of life and bloodshed, targeting of those who helped us during our time in the country, and a variety of other challenges, which will undoubtedly include the ability of Al-Qaeda and perhaps the Islamic State to reestablish sanctuaries in a country that is largely controlled by a medieval, ultra-conservative, theocratic Islamist regime.
Thank you. We have just a few minutes, but Bernard-Henri Lévy, they're yours. Please go ahead.
Hello, me? Okay, a problem of connection, I think. Okay, a few words. To say what went wrong will be unfinishable, of course, because democracy is slow, republic is slow. To build a republic and a democracy is a very, very long process. But what we did well is so conspicuous for someone who has been on the field all over the years. As General Petraeus said, number one, the women. You just have to be in Kabul, to be in Mazar-i-Sharif, to be in Panjshir, to see the change between the time of Taliban and the time till the last weeks. Liberation of women. Women daring to show their face, having the right to go to school, practicing gender equality as it was unconceivable 20 years ago. Alas, this might change again now. I receive every week, every day sometimes, some videos from the French ambassador in Kabul, from my friends in Panjshir, Ahmad Massoud, with the young lion of Panjshir today, showing us a terrible situation, the lapidation, the stone death condemnation resuming in some villages which are taken again by the Pakistanis. So of course now it can go back, but it was an achievement of these 20 years, number one. Number two, as I said, civil society and the building of the start of the building of a free press. We have, ladies and gentlemen, a partner. You have Middle East Institute in Kabul, which is called MOBI, the MOBI Group, who have an incredible channel of news, Tolo News, with incredibly brave journalists, female and men, going on the ground, making genuine reports with a freedom of speech and a freedom of investigation, which was again impossible to imagine 40 years ago when I made my first travel, and even 20 years ago when President Chirac sent me. This is an achievement which was fulfilled, performed under the umbrella of our brotherhood, us the West, with the Afghan people. And number three, Mr. Ambassador, you are so right when you speak of Pakistan. But watch one point. This link between Afghanistan and Pakistan is a death link, a link of death for Afghan people, maybe also for Pakistanis people, by the way, and for the West. The last article of your American citizen and hero, Daniel Pearl, for the Wall Street Journal, his last article, one of his last articles in the Wall Street Journal, was for putting the finger on this horrible link between Pakistan and Afghanistan. It was to suspect that there might have been at this time, beginning of the 2000s, some criminal traffics between the two countries regarding even dirty devices, maybe nuclear devices. This was the thesis of our colleague, Daniel Pearl. And I think it was true. I think Pakistan is a rogue state with terrible arsenals of weapons. And thus, his link with Afghanistan is one of the sources of the worst for the world. This link was cut in these last 10 years, and in the 20 years, more and more cut. And this link is precisely what the Taliban, who are on the process of coming back, are trying to re-establish. One of the worst news coming from the field in the last days was the fact that the district of Spin Boldak fell again under the boot of the Taliban. What is the district of Spin Boldak? It is the border district between Afghanistan and Pakistan. This border district can be opened again. One of the achievements of what was attempted by America, by the West, and by the Republican forces in Afghanistan was precisely to break this link, to impeach, to prevent this unification, in a way, these two countries becoming one area. So these achievements were not nothing. These achievements were a great heritage to which we are turning our back at this moment. Not all of us. There are still women and men of goodwill in America, in Europe, who are concerned by that, who have a part of their heart still remaining in Afghanistan at the side of the brave commander.
I'm afraid that we have lost contact with you. I don't know if you hear us. Go ahead. Oh, thank you so much. Well, we've reached the conclusion of our program. I just wanted to add one thought on this topic that we've been discussing here. For me, looking at the 50 years that I mentioned before of experience with Afghanistan, taking us through the kingdom, the Dawood Republic, and the jihad years and so on. And even my being in Kabul during the time that the Taliban were in control, what stands out to me in the way of accomplishments here is that never in the history of Afghanistan has there been such a great collection here of human capital as has been realized under this Islamic Republic that we have. And the millions of Afghans who have educated Afghans who have invested so heavily their lives really in the success of the Islamic Republic. And the tragedy would be is that they would have no home anymore, that they could not thrive, they could not conceive of coexisting with a emirate such as the Taliban would bring into force, and that they would become refugees. So I emphasize how much particularly has been accomplished here on a human level here that we should so treasure, because it is unique in the history of the country, but unique also beyond that. Okay, I hope this program has been edifying and that many of you will now want to read the book. I want to thank Bernard-Henri Lévy, David Petraeus, who had to leave us, and Javed Ahmed for joining this morning with their valuable comments. This program will be available in recorded form on the MEI website. So if you know others that have not had a chance to join us this morning, that will be their opportunity to watch this program. Khodafez, B'mane Khoda.